They say a single moment can change everything. For James Walker, that moment came on a freezing January morning in New York City, when desperation finally overcame his pride. All he asked for was $1, the smallest request he could think of, barely enough for a cup of coffee. But when he directed that simple request to Barron Trump, neither man could have predicted how it would change both their lives forever. This isn't just another story about a chance encounter between the privileged and the poor. It's about seeing, beyond appearances, about remembering our shared humanity, and about how sometimes the smallest requests can lead to the biggest changes. What happened next would not only transform one homeless veteran's life, but would also reveal something remarkable about a young man who most people only knew through headlines and photographs. Sometimes, the true measure of a person isn't in their name or their status, but in how they respond when someone asks for help. It all started when James Walker pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders as the January wind whistled through the streets of New York City. His breath made little clouds in the freezing air, and his fingers had long since gone numb. The cardboard he sat on did little to protect him from the cold sidewalk, but it was better than nothing. At 62 years old, James never thought he'd end up here. Just 8 months ago, he had an apartment, a job as a night security guard, and enough money to get by. Then came the heart problems, the dizzy spells, the hospital bills. Now, all he had was his backpack containing a few changes of clothes, his military ID card, and the last photo of his wife Sarah and their son Michael before the car accident took them both 10 years ago. People hurried past him on their way to work, clutching their coffee cups and staring at their phones. James watched them, remembering when he used to be just like them. He'd put on his security guard uniform each evening, kiss Sarah goodbye, and head to his shift. Michael would usually be doing homework at the kitchen table, always looking up to wave and say, "Stay safe, Dad." A young woman in high heels nearly tripped over his outstretched legs. "Sorry," James mumbled, tucking his feet closer to the wall. She didn't even look at him. Nobody ever did anymore. It was like he'd become invisible the day he lost his apartment. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the day before yesterday. The soup kitchen on 42nd Street would open in a few hours, but that felt like an eternity away. James had 27 cents in his pocket. He knew the exact amount because he counted it several times an hour, hoping somehow the coins would multiply if he checked often enough. A gust of wind sent an empty potato chip bag dancing across the sidewalk. James watched it flutter past, remembering how Michael used to chase bits of paper caught in the wind, pretending they were butterflies. Sarah would laugh, her eyes crinkling at the corners, telling their son not to go too far. The memory made James's chest ache worse than his bad heart ever did. He'd tried to find work, of course. But at his age, with his health problems, nobody wanted to take a chance on him. The Veterans Affairs Office was helping with his medical care, but the waiting lists for housing assistance were months long. His military pension helped, but most of it went to paying off the hospital bills that had stacked up before his VA benefits kicked in. James shifted on his cardboard seat, his joints stiff from the cold. He'd chosen this spot carefully. It was near a busy subway entrance, but tucked just far enough away that the police didn't usually bother him. The morning rush hour crowd provided enough foot traffic that sometimes people would drop spare change near him, though he never directly asked for anything. Sarah had always taught Michael that a person's pride was worth more than money, and James held on to that belief even now. The sun was fully up now, but it did little to warm the bitter January air. James watched a group of businessmen in expensive coats walk past, talking loudly about stock prices and profit margins. One of them wore shoes that probably cost more than James used to make in a month. He tried not to feel bitter about it. Everyone had their own path in life, he reminded himself. His had just taken an unexpected turn. A commotion further down the street caught his attention. A small crowd was gathering, phones raised to take pictures. James craned his neck to see what was happening, and that's when he noticed the security guards. They moved with professional precision, clearing a path through the growing crowd. James recognized their formation from his own security training. It was a standard protective detail pattern. Between the guards walked a tall, teenage boy. James blinked hard, making sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. The boy's face was familiar from news coverage and magazine covers. Even without the headlines, there was no mistaking that height, that bearing, those features so similar to his father's. Something stirred in James's chest as he watched the young man approach. It wasn't hope. He'd learned not to hope for anything these days. It wasn't desperation either, though his empty stomach reminded him again of how long it had been since his last meal. No, it was something else, something that reminded him of watching Michael grow up, of seeing the man his son was starting to become before the accident changed everything. The security detail was getting closer. James's heart pounded, partly from his medical condition and partly from a feeling he couldn't quite name. The boy was nearly level with his spot now. For the first time in months, James felt an urge to speak up, to reach out, to ask for help. His throat felt dry. His hands trembled, and not just from the cold. The young man was only a few steps away. James watched him through the gaps between his security guards, caught a glimpse of his expression. Thoughtful, serious, yet somehow kind. In that moment, James saw something of his own son in the boy's face, and before he could stop himself, he began to stand up. James's knees cracked as he pushed himself up from the cold sidewalk. His legs felt like lead, stiff from sitting for so long in the freezing weather. The world spun a little, probably from hunger, he thought, but he steadied himself against the brick wall behind him. "Never beg, James," Sarah's voice echoed in his head. It was one of the last things she'd told him before the accident. "No matter what happens, keep your dignity. Promise me." He'd promised her then, holding her hand in the hospital room, not knowing those would be among her final words. The security detail was almost parallel to him now. One of the guards had already noticed his movement, hand shifting slightly toward his concealed weapon. James recognized the subtle gesture from his own training. He knew he should sit back down. He knew he should stay quiet. He knew what Sarah would want. But then another memory flashed through his mind. Michael at 14, the same age this boy appeared to be now. They'd been walking home from a baseball game when they passed a homeless woman. Michael had stopped, pulled out the $10 he'd saved for a new comic book, and given it to her without hesitation. "Why'd you do that, son?" James had asked afterward. Michael had looked up at him with those earnest brown eyes. "Because we can help, Dad. And if we can help but don't, what does that make us?" The memory hit James like a physical blow. His son had understood something at 14 that many adults never learned. Sometimes pride had to take a back seat to survival, and maybe, just maybe, asking for help wasn't the same as begging. The young man, Barron Trump, James was certain now, was 3 steps past him. In a few seconds, he'd be gone. The security guards were already starting to relax, having deemed James a non-threat. This was his only chance. James's mouth felt like cotton. His heart thundered in his chest, and not just from his condition. What would Sarah think? What would Michael say? He'd been a proud man his whole life. 22 years in the military had taught him to be self-reliant. Even after losing everything, he'd never asked anyone for help. 2 steps past now. James. remembered the recruiting office where he'd signed up at 18. "Walker," his drill sergeant had said, "you've got more pride than sense." Maybe the old sergeant had been right. Maybe pride was what had kept him on this street instead of swallowing it and asking for help sooner. One step past, James's stomach cramped sharply. When was the last time he'd eaten? 2 days ago? 3? The dates blurred together now. The soup kitchen seemed so far away, and he was so tired of being cold, of being hungry, of being invisible. "Do it, Dad," he could almost hear Michael saying. "It's okay to need help sometimes." James's legs trembled as he took a small step forward. The security guard on the left turned slightly, watching him. James opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat was too dry, his shame too great. The boy was almost out of reach now. "I'm sorry, Sarah," James whispered under his breath. Then, summoning every ounce of courage he had left, the same courage that had earned him 2 Purple Hearts in Desert Storm, he took another step forward. "Excuse me," he managed to croak out, his voice rough from disuse. "Young man," the security detail tensed. The guard on the left moved to block James's line of sight. But between the guard's shoulders, James saw Barron Trump stop walking. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the gap. The boy's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, something that reminded James so much of Michael that his vision blurred with tears. "Sir," one of the guards said firmly, "please step back." James's legs shook harder. Everything in him screamed to retreat, to sit back down, to disappear into the background again. But Michael's voice echoed in his memory. "If we can help, but don't. What does that make us?" And so, fighting against every proud bone in his body, James Walker, former staff sergeant, loving husband, grieving father, prepared to do something he'd never done before in his 62 years of life. He was going to ask a stranger for help. Could you spare $1? The words felt like rocks in James's mouth, each one heavier than the last. His military training screamed at him to stand at attention, but his worn-out body could barely stay upright. "Please," he added, the word barely a whisper. The security guards exchanged glances, their bodies forming a tighter wall between James and their charge. One reached for his radio, probably to call for backup. James knew the drill. He'd done it himself, countless times when someone approached a VIP he was protecting. But then, something unexpected happened. A tall figure stepped between the guards, moving with a grace that caught them off guard. "It's okay," Barron Trump said, his voice deeper than James had expected. "Give us a moment, please." The guards hesitated, their training warring with their duty to follow their charge's requests. The one with the radio kept his hand near it, while the others shifted to form a wider circle, giving their charge space while maintaining security. James found himself looking directly into the young man's eyes. They were sharp and observant, taking in every detail of James's appearance. But there was no judgment in that gaze, no disgust or pity, just curiosity. And something else, something that reminded James of the way Michael used to look at complex math problems, like he was working out a puzzle in his head. "You're a veteran," Barron said. It wasn't a question. His eyes had found the worn military ID card clipped to James's jacket. His one remaining piece of pride, the thing that still identified him as someone who had served his country. "Yes, sir," James replied automatically, his back straightening, slightly despite his exhaustion. "Staff Sergeant James Walker, sir. Desert Storm." The military courtesy flowed naturally, like putting on an old, comfortable uniform. A small crowd was gathering now, people slowing their rush to work to watch the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording. James felt his face burn with shame. Tomorrow, would he be just another viral video? Homeless vet begs Trump's son? He started to step back, his courage failing. "You've been here all week," Barron said, suddenly, stopping James in his tracks. "Since Monday. You read the newspaper someone left on the bench every morning. You helped that lady pick up her groceries when her bag broke yesterday." James blinked in surprise. "You noticed me?" "I notice a lot of things," Barron replied, his voice matter-of-fact. "Like how you never ask anyone for money, how you make sure to keep your area clean, how you give directions to lost tourists, even though most of them pretend they can't see. You!" A gust of wind whipped down the street, causing James to shiver violently. His thin jacket might as well have been tissue paper. Without seeming to think about it, Barron took a step closer, using his height to block some of the wind. "Why today?" Barron asked. "Why ask me?" The question hit James like a punch to the gut. Why, indeed? He looked at the young man in front of him, seeing both the power of his family name and the simple presence of a teenager trying to understand the world around him. "You?" James swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You reminded me of my son. Something in your eyes. He was about your age when—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but something in Barron's expression changed, softened almost imperceptibly. More phones were pointing their way now. The security guards were getting antsy. This had gone on longer than they were comfortable with. One of them stepped forward. "Sir, we need to move on." Barron held up one hand, not taking his eyes off James. "Your son," he said quietly. "What was his name?" "Michael," James whispered. And for the first time in years, saying his son's name didn't feel like a blade in his heart. His name was Michael. The wind gusted again, carrying with it the sounds of the city. Car horns, distant sirens, the rumble of the subway below their feet. For a moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to just this piece of sidewalk, this conversation between a homeless veteran and a teenager who reminded him so much of his lost son. Barron glanced at his security detail, then back at James. His hand moved toward his pocket, and the guards tensed again. But there was something in the young man's expression now, something that made James's heart skip a beat. It wasn't pity. He'd seen enough of that to recognize it. No, this was different. This was the look of someone who had just made an important decision. "Mr. Walker," Barron said, his voice carrying an authority beyond his years, "would you mind waiting here for a few minutes? I'd like to make a phone call." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The security guards looked as confused as he felt, but they maintained their positions as Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their whispers creating a constant buzz of speculation. James wanted to disappear, to sink into the sidewalk, to be anywhere but here. But something made him stay rooted to the spot. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was just the way Barron had said his name. Mr. Walker, like he was still somebody who mattered. As Barron dialed a number on his phone, James couldn't help but wonder what Sarah would think of him now. Would she understand why he broke his promise? Would she forgive him? And Michael? Would his son be proud or ashamed of his father in this moment? The phone rang once, twice, and then someone answered. Barron turned slightly away from the crowd, but James could still hear his first words. "Dad's office? This is Barron. I need to speak to the property manager at the tower." "Yes, it's urgent." "No, everything's fine, but I need a favor." James stood perfectly still, his military training kicking in as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The crowd around them had grown larger, their phones still recording every moment. His legs trembled from standing so long, but he didn't dare move. Barron's voice drifted back to him in fragments as the young man paced in a small circle, protected by his security detail. Yes. No. Today. I understand. But this is important. Yes. I'll hold. One of the security guards offered Barron a tablet, which he accepted with a nod, his phone still pressed to his ear. His fingers moved quickly across the screen while he waited, pausing occasionally to type something longer. Mr. Walker? Barron turned back to James, covering his phone's microphone with one hand. Would you mind telling me which VA hospital you've been working with? James blinked in surprise. The Manhattan VA Medical Center, he answered, his voice rough. But how did you know I was... The medication bottles in your backpack, Barron explained, gesturing to where James's worn bag sat against the wall. They have the VA label. He turned his attention back to his phone call. Yes, I'm here. No, I need to speak with him directly. Yes, I'll wait. A woman in the crowd pushed forward slightly, her designer coat marking her as one of the many professionals who worked in the area. Barron, she called out. What are you doing? Can we help? The security guards moved to intercept her, but Barron shook his head slightly. Thank you, but please, give us some space. His voice was polite but firm, carrying an authority that made the woman step back. James's head was spinning, and not just from hunger. This morning, he'd been invisible. Now he stood in the center of a growing crowd, while a boy who reminded him so much of Michael made mysterious phone calls and asked about his medical care. Part of him wanted to run, to escape back into anonymity. But a stronger part, the part that sounded like his son, told him to stay. Yes, sir, Barron was saying into his phone, his voice taking on a more formal tone. I understand the protocols, but this is a special circumstance. Yes, I can verify his military service. No, sir. I'm looking at his ID right now. Thank you, sir. The young man covered his phone again and turned to James. Mr. Walker, I have a few questions, if you don't mind. They're personal, but they're important. James nodded, still not entirely sure what was happening. When did you last have a full medical checkup? 3 months ago, at the VA, James replied automatically. They said my heart condition needs... He stopped, embarrassed to discuss his health problems in front of the growing crowd. Barron seemed to understand. He moved closer, lowering his voice. The heart condition, is that what led to losing your job? Yes, James admitted. Security companies don't want guards who might have attacks on duty. Can't blame them, really. Barron nodded, making a note on the tablet. And your military specialty? What did you do in the service? Military police, 22 years. Made staff sergeant before Desert Storm. After that, civilian security work until... He gestured vaguely at his chest. A small smile crossed Barron's face, the first real smile James had seen from him. Military police, he repeated, turning back to his phone. Yes, sir. I'm still here. Exactly. MP background, with civilian security experience. Yes, that's correct. Thank you, sir. The wind had picked up again, and James couldn't stop himself from shivering. Without missing a beat in his phone conversation, Barron shrugged off his coat, a movement that made his security detail visibly uncomfortable, and held it out to James. Sir, that's not necessary. James started to protest, but Barron fixed him with a look so much like Michael's "don't argue with me, Dad" expression that the words died in his throat. He took the coat with trembling hands, his eyes burning with Unexpected tears. "Mr. Walker," Barron said, still holding his phone but covering the microphone again, "I know this is strange. I know you didn't expect any of this when you decided to speak to me. But sometimes life gives us unexpected moments that can change everything. My father taught me that. And my mother taught me that when you have the power to help someone, you should." James slipped on the coat, its warmth overwhelming after months of winter chill. It was too long for him. Barron was remarkably tall for his age, but at that moment it felt like armor, like protection, like hope. "Yes, I'm here." Barron returned to his phone call. "Can you connect me with HR?" "Yes, I'll hold again." He looked at James. "Just a few more minutes, Mr. Walker. I promise this will be worth your time." The crowd had started to thin as people reluctantly headed to their offices, though many remained, watching and recording. Social media was probably already buzzing, with speculation about what was happening. James could imagine the headlines: "Trump's son's strange encounter with homeless vet," or "Mystery meeting on NYC street." But for the first time in months, James didn't care what people thought when they looked at him. For the first time since losing his job, since ending up on the streets, since watching his life crumble around him, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: dignity. Barron was typing rapidly on the tablet again while he waited on hold. One of his security guards leaned in to whisper something, probably about their schedule, but Barron shook his head. "This is important," he said firmly. "Everything else can wait." James watched the boy, no, the young man, handle multiple conversations, coordinate with different people, and maintain his composure under the public scrutiny. He couldn't help but think that Michael would have been like this if he'd had the chance to grow up. The thought didn't hurt as much as it usually did. "Ah, yes, thank you for taking my call." Barron's voice became more businesslike. "I'm looking at his qualifications now." "Yes, that's correct. I understand the position requirements." "No, I think he'd be perfect for it." "Yes, I'll hold for the director." A new wave of murmurs swept through the remaining crowd as a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Two more security guards stepped out, scanning the area professionally. One of them approached Barron and spoke quietly in his ear. Barron covered his phone once more and turned to James. "Mr. Walker, I need about 10 more minutes to finish these calls. Would you be willing to wait in the car where it's warm? My security team will stay with you, and I give you my word that this isn't a trick to make you leave." James looked at the luxury vehicle, then back at Barron's earnest face. 24 hours ago, he would have said no. He would have retreated to his cardboard seat, held on to his pride, kept his promise to Sarah. But now, wearing this young man's coat, witnessing this unexpected kindness, he remembered something else Sarah used to say: "God helps those who help themselves, but sometimes he sends that help through others." "Yes," James said, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. "Yes, I'll wait." The SUV's interior was warmer than anywhere James had been in months. The leather seat seemed to not to wrap around him, and for a moment he worried about getting it dirty. But the security guard who'd opened the door for him, Johnson, according to his earpiece conversation, had simply nodded respectfully and said, "Make yourself comfortable, Sergeant." Through the tinted windows, James could see Barron still, on his phone, pacing with the tablet in his free hand. The remaining crowd had thinned to about a dozen people, though their phones were still recording. Someone had brought Barron a new coat, which he'd slipped on while continuing his calls. "Would you like some water, sir?" Johnson asked, holding out a bottle. James took it gratefully, trying to remember his manners and not gulp it down all at once. His hands shook less now that he was warm, and Barron's coat still felt like a shield. Around his shoulders, outside, Barron was smiling at whatever he was hearing on the phone. He gave a thumbs up to one of his security guards, who immediately pulled out his own phone and stepped away to make a call. James watched as Barron finished his conversation, shook hands with several people who had emerged from nearby buildings, and finally walked back to the SUV. The door opened, and Barron slid into the seat across from James. His face was flushed with excitement, but his voice was calm and professional. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Walker. I have made some arrangements, if you're willing to hear them." James nodded, not trusting his voice. The surreal quality of the morning had only increased with each passing moment. "First," Barron said, consulting his tablet, "there's a room waiting for you at our hotel 3 blocks from here. It's yours for the next month. No charges, no conditions. This will give you a permanent address for job applications and a chance to rest properly." James's mouth fell open, but Barron continued before he could speak. "Second, I spoke with our HR department. They have an opening for a security consultant at Trump Tower. The position involves training new guards and reviewing security protocols. It's mostly desk work, so your heart condition won't be an issue. They'd like to interview you this afternoon, if you're feeling up to it." Tears welled up in James's eyes, but he blinked them back. I don't know what to say." "I'm not finished," Barron said, a small smile playing at his lips. "Third, I spoke with the VA hospital. They're expecting you tomorrow morning for a full checkup. All expenses will be covered by our family's Veterans Support Foundation. They'll also help fast-track your housing assistance application." A sound escaped James's throat, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why do all this?" Barron was quiet for a moment, looking down at his tablet. When he looked up, his eyes were serious. "You reminded me of something my mother always tells me. To whom much is given, much is expected. But it's more than that. When you approached me today, you didn't ask for a handout. You asked for $1. The smallest amount you could think of, I guess. But I've been watching you all week." He swiped through something on his tablet. "You keep your area clean. You help others despite having nothing yourself. You maintain your dignity even in impossible circumstances. And you were willing to break your own rule about asking for help, not because you wanted to, but because you had to." James thought about protesting, about saying it was too much, about explaining that he didn't deserve such kindness. But then he remembered Michael's words from so long ago. "If we can help but don't, what does that make us?" "There's one more thing," Barron said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a business card and handed it to James. "This is my father's personal assistance number. If you have any problems with any of these arrangements, you call this number. They're expecting to hear from you." Outside the SUV, the world continued to move. People hurried past. Phones captured photos. Social media buzzed with speculation. But inside this warm cocoon, James Walker, former staff sergeant, loving husband, grieving father, felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. "Hope, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your parents must be very proud of you." A faint blush colored Barron's cheeks. "I just did what anyone should do when they can help." James shook his head. "No, you did what my Michael would have done. He always saw people, really saw them, just like you did." Barron smiled, and for a moment, the weight of his family name, the pressure of the public eye, the formality of their situation, all fell away. He was just a teenager who'd found a way to help someone in need. "The hotel is expecting you," he said, pulling up another document on his tablet. "And the interview is at 2 o'clock. That gives you time to get settled, have a proper meal, and change into the suit they're sending up to your room." James fingered the business card in his hand, still struggling to process everything. "I don't know how I'll ever repay—" "You already have," Barron interrupted gently. "You reminded me that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest requests. All you asked for was $1, Mr. Walker. But what you really did was give me a chance to make a difference." As the SUV pulled away from the curb, James looked back at the spot where he'd spent so many cold nights. His cardboard seat was still there, pressed against the wall. But he wasn't going back to it. Instead, he was heading toward something he'd almost forgotten existed: a future. Sarah would understand, he thought. She'd know why he broke his promise about asking for help. And Michael would be proud. Not just of his father for having the courage to ask, but of this young man who'd taken the time to really see someone in need and do something about it. "Ready, Mr. Walker?" Barron asked, as the SUV stopped in front of a gleaming hotel. James straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of Barron's coat, no longer cold, no longer invisible, no longer lost. "Yes," he said firmly. "Yes, I'm ready." And he was. Ready to accept help, ready to rebuild his life, ready to honor his son's memory by showing the same kindness to others once he was back on his feet. After all, sometimes the biggest changes in life start with something as simple as asking for $1 and finding not just help, but hope, dignity, and a reminder that in this vast, often indifferent city, there are still people who take the time to truly see those around them. Thank you for reading this story of compassion and hope. If you were touched by James and Barron's encounter, you might also be moved by another remarkable tale of unexpected kindness. Donald Trump discovers a loyal supporter is homeless. What he does next shocks everyone. It's another powerful reminder that acts of kindness can come from unexpected places and change lives forever. We'd love to know where you're reading from. Whether you're in a bustling city like New York or somewhere across the globe, stories of human connection touch us all. Share your location in the comments below and let us know what this story meant to you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed an act of kindness that changed someone's life? Your stories inspire others and remind us that compassion knows no borders. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more such interesting stories.